Hello, I'm Paul Orselli, President and Chief Instigator at Paul Orselli Workshop here on Long Island. And through the magic of technology, I'm joined by wonderful Margaret Middleton across the waves in Belfast, right, today?
Yes.
Super. So we will pray to the network gods that the connection stays as nice as it is now. So, Margaret, we're going to talk today about, or at least start the conversation with the notion of feminine design. But before we do that, maybe you could just give a little brief bio or intro of yourself for people who may not know you.
Sure. I'm an independent exhibit designer and museum consultant. And yeah, I'm living and working in Belfast, Northern Ireland.
Living your best life in Ireland. Good for you.
Yeah, it's pretty
Um,
great. I'm not gonna lie.
all the things I see online, you seem like a pretty happy camper, you and your partner. So good for you both. Um, so I've noticed that you have posted recently about a chapter that you've written for a book, and it intrigued me because you were talking about the notion of feminine design. So rather than me trying to paraphrase your wonderful work, I'd just be interested if you could share what feminine design means from your perspective and how it can be employed fruitfully by designers and in institutions like museums.
Yeah, so the chapter that you're talking about is called On Feminine Exhibition Design. And it's in this edited volume called Feminist Designer. And it's from MIT Press. So it's like a really beautiful book.
And we
And
will, and just not to interrupt you, but I always like to say, since we're on YouTube, we can also put links and information about all the stuff
brilliant.
we're talking about, including this book. So if people are like, where can I get the book? I'm so interested in what Margaret was talking about. So
Yeah, well, and my chapter is just a very small part of a very interesting book that kind of runs the gamut of all different kinds of feminist design. So, um, but mine is specifically on exhibition design because that's, you know, what I do. And this is basically um, it's actually an adaptation of an article that I wrote for Exhibition Journal a few years back, and it's about I sort of start with a bit of a personal narrative about how in my work in children's museums, specifically and also science centers, how I've encountered maybe some like resistance in myself or to my with my teammates when we're thinking about um, the design and of what we're doing, of the exhibits that we're making. So um, I was realizing that I had that maybe done some like self-censorship, that I had seemed to think that like maybe if I had done something that was like really overtly girly, that that would somehow be like alienating to non-feminine children who were visiting the museum somehow. Um and so that was really where this was coming from. I had the chance to design an exhibit about Barbie dolls for the Living Computer Museum uh, in Seattle, and that was like a moment where I was like, "Why have I never used like a lot of pink in an exhibit? Why have I got to like I downloaded a bunch of new fonts to my computer. Like it was like this really exciting moment. I was like, if I'm having so much fun doing this, like where has that joy been? Like what have I been suppressing in my own work? Um,
plus
and why?
you were ahead of the Barbie movie.
Yeah, yeah, by several years, yeah. Um, I had, yeah, I was just thinking about it this year, of course. and reminiscing about how much fun that exhibit was to design. And yeah, so what I did with the article and with the chapter is I decided I was going to isolate 6 or 7 qualities that I thought were things that kind of represented femininity that maybe I could be more intentional about using in my exhibits. So
Cool.
that's really what the structure of the chapters really does.
So, for somebody like myself, although I suppose everyone is on a spectrum between masculine aspects and feminine aspects, but so are these guidelines something that, from your perspective, and I'm asking this question seriously, are guidelines that could be used by anyone, or what are your thoughts about those guidelines in terms of their facility for designers thinking about employing feminine design approaches?
Yeah, well, I think anyone can use them. And they're really appropriate for any exhibit too. Um, really what I was trying to do was resist this phenomenon called androcentrism that prioritizes the sensibilities of what's considered like this sort of default neutral man. And I liked what you said earlier about how all of us, have some femininity, some masculinity, that this is like, it's definitely not like femininity is not the exclusive realm of women. And that it definitely it goes beyond gender identity in a really big way.
Well, I think as much as sometimes all of us would like the world or parts of the world to be clearly black and white, the more I experience things, the more I see the world on a spectrum and not so neatly defined. So what are some of the maybe you could just share a couple of the approaches that when you are thinking about um, feminine exhibition design that people can be mindful of or employ in a project.
Yeah, well, so I can just name each of them, and if you want, I can go into more detail about one or two of them if you like.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
They're
That's great.
the qualities that I've identified, and this is not like an exhaustive list. The reason I came up with a list was because it was an easy way for me to kind of run through like a little bit of a checklist when I'm doing my work. I can think about them and it just sort of gets my mind going in that direction. So the qualities I identified are curvilinear form, softness, nurturance, sparkle, color, and cuteness and humility.
No, that's quite a list. So
Yeah.
maybe you could pick out one or two of ones that are either your favorites or ones that are underutilized or underappreciated by designers.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think sparkle is a good one.
I was thinking of Sparkle, so that's great.
Yeah. Well, I think I mean, one thread that kind of runs through this is playfulness.
Yeah.
That there's some associations. You talk about a binary, there's some associations with like masculinity and femininity, and like there's just there's more levity and more joy on the feminine side a lot of times, that masculinity is seen as more serious. And yeah, you think about like a business suit, or like like something gray
We're
maybe, like
doing we're doing real work here.
right, right. Yeah, lack of emotion is definitely like aligned with traditional ideas of masculinity. So that is one of the threads that kind of runs through a lot of this. So, but I do think of Sparkle as being like exceptionally fun. And it's really inspired by, you know, girlishness, the way that like we look. A lot of this is responding to the way that consumer goods are marketed.
Yeah.
A lot of things are, marketed to girls, that are, they're sparkly, um, thinking
M-
about.
My Little Pony.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, like you can just think of like all of these different products that are marketed to girls that have sparkle in them somehow, if it's glitter, or there's other like prismatic effects. And sparkle is it can be about reflection or refraction, and it's it can be about like light quality. It could also be when you see like you've seen some like really beautiful pictures of galaxies, um, with like sparkly nebulae, things like that. Like there's just like a lot of um, it's effervescent, and it's exciting.
There's a lot of sparkle in the universe, not just in the
Yeah,
design universe.
yeah, totally. Um, yeah, so I think about like some of the materials that I've used, like vinyl, like sparkly vinyl that goes on a like for upholstery vinyl, like
Hmm.
that sparkle that you might find at a diner, or dichroic acrylic, which has like that really beautiful iridescence to it. And I've definitely put all sorts of like one of my favorite things to do when I worked in children's museums was to pop prisms in different places that would catch the light at different times of the
Yeah.
day. And yeah, like things that you could like a sun catcher or something like that. Disco ball, mirrors, all of that fun stuff.
So, obviously, when you use materials like that, or you create situations with reflections or spectrums or rainbows, you're helping people feel certain ways in the exhibition, I think, and maybe less. Well, it's interesting, maybe less serious, or maybe in some ways, I mean, if you're thinking about a light catching a prism or that, people could find that awesome or be literally contemplative or reflective about that. So that's good. So sparkle, that's a nice thing. What's one other one that stands out from your list that is maybe one that you use a lot, or maybe one that's underutilized?
Well, I think humility is a
Mm.
really fun one that has a lot of there's a lot of possibility with humility. It's to me what it means is it's about the sort of the service role of the exhibit, like the deference to the visitor. I think it's much more. I think we've been seeing a trend over the past, 10 or 20 years of being much more interested in what visitors have to say, in the exhibit, or like having a little bit of input.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, yeah, right. Um, a lot of this to me is really just about like being a good designer. But humility specifically, there's this I think there's a trend towards shared authority, which really comes from this. It really comes from a tradition of feminist facilitation. I think it's not an accident that we're seeing a lot more of that, as there's a more of an emphasis on museum education, which has been described by many researchers as like a pink collar profession. Um, so I think that there's a I think that's where that the femininity of that approach comes from, that it's not hierarchical, and it's not the exhibit like sort of like forcing its will on you. You get to like so we're seeing that in talk back boards and other sort of ways for people to express themselves in the exhibit, or um, questions like having some of the labels be questions that get people thinking or start dialogues. The idea that maybe there's more than one right answer, that kind of thing.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, if you think about an exhibition experience as being more of a true conversation or an engagement between people instead of a traditional sort of top-down curatorial soliloquy or authoritarian sort of soliloquy. Um, I would imagine that that notion fits into humility, but also the other aspects of feminine design that you spoke about, which makes me think about how does feminine design fit into some of the larger contexts of ideas that have been spinning around in the museum world and the design world. I mean, of course, we think about aspects of so-called accessible design or universal design. Um, we also, hearkening back to what you just said about humility, um, the movement and interest in museums not being neutral. They're not neutral.
Yeah.
And also museums sort of um, trying to break free in many cases of their colonial roots or classist roots. So I just be interested in throwing the door open to your creative mind and where, if it does feminine design fit into the larger context of these museum cultural issues and also design issues? I've given you the entire universe to play with here, Margaret. No pressure.
Well, I mean, the sense that museums are not neutral, that's, to me, this exercise of thinking about feminine exhibit design is about centering the margins. And
Ooh,
by
wait, what do you mean by that exactly? Centering the margins.
Well, when we're talking about androcentrism, there's this larger idea of like who this expected visitor is. He's not only a man, but he's also able-bodied, and he's non-disabled rather, and he's white, and he comes from a very particular class, right? And like all of these, we have like all of these like sort of expectations about like who this visitor is, and um,
Sounds like me. No.
well, in a lot of ways, he sounds like me too. And I think that like it's really easy to sort of be like, well, sure, like I think this kind of would probably work for everybody, right? Because it
Yeah,
works
no,
for
no. It's
um,
funny. It makes me think, especially since we both worked in children's museums a lot, when you're talking with a client or a project partner, and then they start talking about something that they did or their kids did, they did with their kids or their kids did, and then they want to sort of expand that as sort of a universal design feature of the project. And I'm like,
yeah,
okay, like I like that your kid did that, but I don't know that that fits into this particular exhibition project. But
yeah, for sure. I feel like, yeah, we've all had that exhibit development conversation for sure. Um, Yeah, well, like I think thinking about when I say centering the margins and thinking about like, well, how would I prioritize instead of prioritize? Because, well, I mean, that is one of the big things, right, about accessible design is the idea of like, well, it can't be one thing because there's so many different experiences, there's so many different bodies, there's so many different um, abilities that you want to be thinking about in the physical design of a space that in many times like they contradict one another. So we kind of always have to think about, well, we are going to be prioritizing somebody, and just being really, really intentional about that. Um, and and so in that way, this exercise is about centering somebody whose sensibilities or experiences may not be like front of mind. Um,
Yeah, I like that earlier when you articulated the different aspects of feminine exhibition design, and you, to paraphrase, described it as sort of a way for to remind yourself, to just have these listed as a way to remind yourself. I think that's a nice way to think about any design tool, whether we're thinking about feminine design or so-called universal design, because as you rightly articulated, you know, there's an infinity of possibilities, and we're never in one design going to hit every one of those things. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to hit many, many of those things. So,
yeah, and if it means that choosing one path is going to alienate some visitors, who can we afford to alienate?
mm,
Meaning not like afford, like I don't mean that in a capitalist sort of sense, but like in a more like who of our visitors can afford to like not be the center of attention? Like I think we can like choose, like, well, I would much rather focus on the person who uses a wheelchair, or the person who, if the family that has two moms, or these are the kinds of people who I'm like much more interested in the museum, because the fact is like as like a white middle class person, like I feel comfortable in like every space, regardless of whether it was like expressly designed for me. I can just like saunter my way in anywhere, and feel great about it. So I don't need to be catered to.
yeah, great. Well, I I really appreciate, as always, you're a deep thinker in the museum business, Margaret. I like the things that you write about and talk about. I think they help all museum designers be more thoughtful about their work, so that's great. I appreciate you taking the time today, and as I mentioned earlier, we will certainly include links to your work, and you have other resources in addition to thinking about feminine design. You've got a great poster, which is a whole different thing in terms of thinking about ways to uh, uh, think about folks and talk about folks and design for a broad range of folks. So we'll share those in the information below. And the network has participated 100% the way we wanted it to. We didn't have any glitches. So I really am happy about that. And I'm always happy to see you, Margaret. Thanks for taking the time today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's always great to see you.
Thanks.